city keeps its secrets, but nothing hides forever. This is the evidence trail. I've seen enough crime scenes to know one thing: people lie, but evidence can lead to the truth. And my partner, Chris G., knows how to read it. Each episode, we open the file, trace the facts, and let the science speak. So watch your step. Once you're on the evidence trail, the truth is coming for you.
Hi everyone, Chris here. I thought I'd mention before we get started that this episode contains discussions of the Grenfell Tower fire, including references to loss of life and its impact on the community. Some listeners may find this content distressing. Please take care while listening and consider skipping this episode if you feel it may be upsetting. Thank you. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Evidence Trail podcast. I'm joined here today by Andrew Langley. He is a lecturer in forensic science and a former senior SOCO, senior scenes of crime officer. But I'll let Andrew introduce himself. So, hello, Andrew.
Yeah, hi. Nice to see you, Chris, and nice to speak to you. Yeah, my name's Andrew Langley. As Chris said, I'm now a senior lecturer at the University of Kent in the chemistry and forensics department there. But I was a scene examiner, a fingerprint expert, and a crime scene manager and operational forensic manager in the Met Police. People who know the Met Police will know that they quite like to call roles different to how the rest of or organise things slightly differently. And that in part is because the volumes of work. So, you have a dedicated team of crime scene manager coordinators who are now called operational forensic managers, who do nothing but critical incidents, usually homicide and unexplained death. And of course, most parts of the country don't have the volumes of work to allow that to happen. So I was in that fortunate position for quite a few years where I had no staff, and I just came in and went from job to job, managing, researching, and it was great. I loved it.
Yeah. So I've had a brief experience with the Met Police. I worked there for about a year and worked with operational forensic managers there. Very different, like you say, from anywhere else you go in the country, where a supervisor, a CSI supervisor, would deal with, say, the crime scene management elements of a scene and deal with the people aspects of the scene. A lot of the operational managers I speak to are quite relieved that they don't have to deal with the HR sort of area of it.
I know I was.
But I do think sometimes it is kind of relentless, isn't it? You're going from job to job to job in a way. So how do you sort of cope with that?
I think you just do. It sounds a bit of a glib answer, but it becomes the norm. I'm not sure that that's particularly healthy. And thankfully, things are now a little bit more progressed into looking out for people's well-being. I'm not always sure that was the case, but it can be a bit relentless. And that's probably why I left a bit early. I still had 5 years left to do. I'd done 35 years, still had 5 years left to do. And I just reached that point where I just felt like I had enough. And I couldn't visualize me doing it for another 5 years. Another opportunity came up and I took it. But it can be a bit relentless. And it's quite important that people realize that the toll it can take on you. And it's not just, as people might think, it's not just the goriness of it all or the sort of the pressure from what you're doing, but it's the working effectively at 100% all the time. Often on shifts. In London we had shifts rather than on call, so I'd be on nights part of every third week. And when you're younger, I never really enjoyed nights, but I could do it. But when you get into your 50s, it starts to get physically quite difficult to do. And I was conscious of the fact that I would be uncomfortable during nights. It would take me about a week to get over it. And then the week after that, I was dreading it starting again. And I thought, I can't really continue like that, open-ended. And there was no option to do that role without being on full shifts. So I think that's what probably pushed me over the edge in the end.
Yeah. Do you think that was the catalyst for you leaving the Met?
Partly. I think partly, yes. It was, it's that pressure of working at 100%. I was always very conscious of the fact that I certainly didn't sort of, my brain wasn't at 100% on nights, and I was always aware of that. You can't make a mistake. You make a mistake in those early stages, it can have dreadful consequences. And that starts to take a toll. And, it gets, I mean, when I left, I was always quite impressed and proud of the fact that I could go to sleep anywhere. If I was in a room full of people in a pub, perhaps, and somebody said, Andrew, go to sleep, 10 minutes later, I'd be asleep. And I thought, all these poor people that can't sleep and suffer from insomnia. It wasn't till after I left that I discovered that's because I was in permanent sleep debt.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a good place to be at all. It took me about 3 or 4 months to actually get out of that and join the happy throng of people who occasionally lie there awake at night.
I think people in the army do just that. They teach themselves to go to sleep for like an hour, 2 hours tops, because they always have to be, on alert, basically.
Yeah,
And their body just finds a way
it's
to-
not good.
No.
Yeah, I don't think that leads to a long and happy life. I don't think.
Yeah.
And the other thing was one of the last major jobs that I was involved in was I was the forensic lead at the mortuary following the fire at Grenfell Tower, and that was a bit different. I don't know if you've worked on DVI type incidents before, but
Yeah.
usually they're sort of a couple of weeks of absolutely stupid hours, ridiculously long days, high pressure, but after that it stops and you spend a few days getting back to normal, getting back to sort of the normal life. It was probably about 3 or 4 days into the Grenfell Tower mortuary where I suddenly realized that this wasn't going to be like that, because nobody had ever dealt with anything quite on that scale before. And I quickly realized that this was going to be months, which of course, you have to manage that as a process. Certainly I was responsible for a lot of the staff there. And you suddenly realize that if we treat this as a normal DVI incident, I need my staff to be well at the end of it, but also still functioning at the extraordinarily high levels that they have to. And I was not confident that I could maintain that in my teams for that period of time. So there was lots of work around that. As part of that, because the government were actually quite worried about the impact that they'd heard about on family liaison officers and some firefighters as well, they came up with some money, as governments sometimes do, and decided they wanted to offer everybody a comprehensive sort of mental health screening. It was quite good in the way it was done. It wasn't done through work. It was completely separate from work. And the idea was that whatever they found wouldn't be communicated to work unless you wanted it to be done. And I was quite keen for my team at the mortuary to go and do it. So I was all for it. And until I suddenly realized, well, hang on a minute, if I want my team to go and do it, I'm going to have to go first.
Yeah.
So I did.
Example.
And I had 2 hours, an hour session over 2 weeks. And at the end, I'd started. I'd been asked, do you think you've got any issues? And I said, well, no, I think I'm fine. I said, I book shifts. I'm tired. I said, and my wife says that I'm a grumpy old sod. But apart from that, everything was fine. And after 2 weeks, the consultant psychologist said to me that, well, she said, I'm quite happy that you've not got any signs of PTSD or anything like that. She said, mind you, your wife's right. So I have an NHS diagnosis of being a grumpy old sod. But then she threw in a comment. She said, perhaps a career change wouldn't be a bad idea. It wasn't a sort of, you must change your career. She just introduced that as, it might not be a good idea to continue doing this day in, day out. Yeah. And I sort of, obviously that went in and lodged. I didn't immediately act on it, but I think it was there. I'd spoken to, done some guest lectures in universities whilst I was working in the Met, and I quite liked the buzz of universities and the sort of the atmosphere there. And then a job came up at Kent, and I thought, well, let's give it a shot, and I got it.
I wonder what that psychologist spotted, because she said, other than being a grumpy old sod, you're all fine. Yeah. But I wonder what it was that you must have said something for her to prompt you to say, a career change isn't a bad idea. We're going to move on and talk about the Grenfell fire. So backstory for anyone that's not aware of the Grenfell fire. So it was a deadly residential fire that occurred in West London in the early hours of the 14th of June 2017. The fire started in a 4th floor flat in the Grenfell Tower, which was a 24-storey public housing building in North Kensington. The fire spread rapidly up the exterior of the building, which was largely due to the cladding that had been added during a refurbishment completed in 2016. So we're talking a year before. 72 people lost their lives and more than 70 were injured, making it the deadliest residential fire in the UK since World War II. Since the fire, investigations have found that the insulation materials did not meet the fire safety standards. There has been criticism of the stay put fire safety advice given. As far as I'm aware, though, that hasn't changed in the country. And there is broader concerns about social housing, safety and inequality. A public inquiry to the Grenfell Tower, the Grenfell Tower inquiry, was launched to determine the responsibility. It led to nationwide reviews of building safety and cladding, and there is an ongoing legal, political and regulatory reforms related to fire safety and building standards ongoing. So you've sort of alluded to it already in what you've said so far, but can you talk us through sort of how did you first become involved in the case?
I first became involved because I answered the phone.
That's always the
I didn't
wrong
have
thing to do.
I didn't have special skills like that. I was like many of my colleagues. I was in an office with several of my colleagues. We had an office together, but I just answered the phone when it rang. And the classic words from my boss were, "What are you doing today, Andrew?" And you know full well at that point that what you were planning to do that day had just changed.
Yep.
And initially, it was, could I go down to the Westminster Mortuary, where they were running the mortuary that was dealing with the fire at Grenfell Tower, because there was an awful lot of Met staff, photographers and various other people who were going to be deployed down there, and they wanted somebody to go down and just make sure things were set up correctly and that our staff were okay. So I went down there and not entirely sure what I was going to see, what I was going to do when I got there, and that was the day after the fire. And I didn't leave there until I think it was early December. And obviously I started there in June.
Wow.
So it was unusual in that everything that you had on the books, everything that you would normally be doing stopped. And you just did nothing but this one incident, which is quite a luxury. It sounds a strange word to use, but you don't often get the chance to do that. But this was something that all the sort of ongoing management that was handed to other people. All of a sudden, the shifts stopped, although the hours didn't go down. But I was there overseeing that process. Those that work or have learned about DVI work, you have a number of key roles in there. And there was one person who was responsible for the reconciliation team. That's the team who basically take all the information from members of the public and from families and all the information from the mortuary, and they put it together to try and confirm identities. Well, they were based at Hendon. So that's up in sort of North London. He was also responsible for work that was ongoing Grenfell Tower itself, dealing with the recoveries, because that process took many months as well. And he was also responsible for what was going on at the mortuary, where we were recovering more evidence and trying to identify people there. So quite often it meant that there wasn't always somebody on site to run the day-to-day operations down there. We were very fortunate. We had a great coroner there. Her Majesty's coroner, senior coroner for West London, Fiona Wilcox, and she was very supportive of what we had to do. But I ended up doing a lot of the day-to-day management. I suddenly realised that everything was set up when I got there. There was a huge number of people there. We had things all set up. There was a CT scanner, so anything coming from the site could be CT scanned. They'd had to knock walls down in the car park of the mortuary to get this sort of thing in. And there was an enormous number of people there. And by the end of day 2, I remember the exact point where everything was up and running. People knew what they were doing. The process was underway. Post-mortems were taking place, and a hush sort of descended onto the mortuary until somebody came up to see me and said, "Can you sort out the toilet? There was only one for 70 people. It's leaking everywhere." And I sort of looked around and realised that, yeah, there's nobody else to do that. So where are the rubber gloves? And the first thing I ended up doing was trying to sort out the toilet, which I did. I was quite impressed, quite pleased with myself, but sorted out the toilet so that things could continue. But I obviously ended up dealing with a lot of the day-to-day management. I mean, as the work progressed there, we quickly realised that the traditional post-mortem in a mortuary with the slabs with running water and all the sort of wet services wasn't really going to be an awful lot of use, because most of the remains we were getting in were dry, and there was no dissection needed. It was dry bone. And that we quickly realised that there was quite a bit of commingling going on, so we needed more space. So we had to, one of the things we did, we had to build a new mortuary, a temporary mortuary in the car park. More walls came down, and we ended up with what we ended up calling the Anthro Village. This mortuary occupied by almost every anthropologist I could find. Fortunately, as well, it was in the university holidays, so some of the students, the sort of final year PhD type students, were coming along and assisting with all the admin as well. And so we had a team of anthropologists just going through the remains, sort of flat by flat, floor by floor, to try and piece these people back together and try and sort of confirm identities for them. So it was an immensely rewarding time. And again, another phrase that people might find strange is, I would say, it's the highlight of my career. You suddenly realize that everything I've learnt, everything I've, all the experience I've gained over the years has just basically all led to this point, where I was standing at that moment of time. So it's a huge honor to do it as well. And, but so, yeah, it's, apart from being at the mortuary, I would go to the site once or twice a week. I didn't always enjoy that, certainly almost until the end. The only way to get to the upper floors was up the staircases.
That's right.
Now, there was a lot of stairs as well, as I recall.
And floors I've just read out, which, more than 24 stairs, if you think however many stairs.
Yes, 24, and you'd be in full PPE with a respirator as well. And I was always conscious of the fact that when you're working hard in a respirator, behind that mask, your mouth, it feels like your mouth can't open wide enough. You just constantly need to get more volume of air in. Yeah. So I didn't enjoy, for that, the physicality of it all, and people that were there day in, day out and going up and down several times a day. Well, it must have been amazing for their thighs, but I didn't give it long enough for that to happen to me. But so I spent some time down there, so I got to see firsthand the conditions there, and it helped to visualize, where remains were coming from. It was useful to see the remains in situ, because you might have something that looked like a perfectly preserved, fully intact skeleton, but as soon as somebody tries to move it, the whole thing starts to fall apart and crumble. So it's very useful to be able to see it. Yes, you'd have imaging of it, things like that, but it's useful to see it where it is, to place some context on it.
Yeah. How do you go about sort of leading a team through an event like that? Because, there'd be a lot of podcasts, went there, on leadership skills and things about how to run a business meeting and how to do this, but it's quite a niche thing to do, really, isn't it? To lead a team through a mass mortuary where you've had to knock down walls, expand the mortuary, you've got like bits of fatalities coming in, traumatic for a lot of people. So how do you keep people sort of, in check and safe?
Well, in my case, you learn as you go.
Yeah.
It's not something that I'm not one of these people that will stand up and say, "Oh, me, I'll do that." No, but I also can't stand it if I feel that something's not being done, if there's a bit of a vacuum. So I ended up in that position. So I had to learn as I went. We were very fortunate with the coroner that we had there, because she was incredibly supportive. She made it an easy place. There was everything we needed, we got. And so it was basically, as well, the other thing that happens when a situation like that is that the team gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, because you need less people and other people don't want to continue. So you end up with a much smaller team. So it's easier in that respect. And you just need to sort of basically be there. You need to be there, listen to people. If you can do something simple to make their lives easier, you do it. And it's just basically being there to being part of the team. That was what it was at that mortuary. It was a team. We used to have, before anything else happened, each day we would have a team. We would have a team meeting. There wasn't always a huge amount to say, but we'd always do that. That was the point at the start of the day. We had like a porter cabin that the coroner had provided. That doesn't do it justice. It was a really nice sort of space where we could get decent coffee and things like that. And everybody, there was a notice board in there, so anything, we could sort of communicate. But we'd always have a meeting in there, and even the coroner would attend. So there was, everybody was part of the team. People had different roles, but it was the team. And we'd explain things that we needed to do, things that perhaps had gone wrong the day before, or any updates that we had, and then everybody would go out and commence their day's work. So if that's how you do it, you basically just keep on, on top of that. But you do need a lot of support.
Yeah.
I realised at one point I was a bit concerned that I wanted some sort of occupational health type representation there, because I realized that a lot of people who were beginning in the early days, people that were struggling with it, I felt horribly exposed and unable to deal with it. So I remember I had one instance with a contractor, not one of my own staff, but somebody I still felt responsible for because they were part of the team, who had to go back home, and home wasn't in the UK. He had to go back home, and I was anxious that once he gets home, who's going to look after him? So I spoke to somebody in the team that dealt with OH within the Met at the time, and they said, his own company can look after him, without realizing that quite often these niche experts, they don't really have a company. It's not a big corporate office with leather sofas and chrome and glass and everything. It's somebody's kitchen table quite often. So I wasn't happy with that. So eventually they sent somebody to go in a car with him to the airport, just to sort of capture some details and do a little bit of a debrief. And I said I wanted some on-site response, and it was well, we can discuss it at next month's meeting. And I said no, I want it now. And the conversation sort of ended. It was one of those conversations where you suddenly think, who was that person I was speaking to?
Yeah.
And you suddenly look them up and discover, they're part of the management board of the Met. Oh dear! But the next morning, a rotational nurse arrived, so we did have our representation. She had to look after all three sites as well, but she became part of the team. The first morning, I described her as a rotating nurse, and she promptly got up and did a 360, and then sat back down again. But she was a very, very important part of the team.
Yeah.
And more people came in. We had nice rest facilities, and the coffee was good, and there was usually something to eat as well. And I remember one day that the chaplain for the Met Police came in. He'd been with another police officer, and she had to go to a meeting, and he said, I'll get a cup of coffee here and wait for you. And he learnt that this was a place where you can get a good cup of coffee. And so after that, if he had meetings in the area, he would pop in. He stopped being the chaplain, and I'm sure he won't mind if I say his name, but he was Jonathan. And Jonathan was part of the team. And because of the skills he had, he was able to speak to people over a cup of tea, not formally, just chatting over a cup of tea, and be able to sort of find out how they really were. So he became an important part of the team because it was welcoming. Not the place you'd normally expect to be welcoming, the mortuary, but it was. Yeah. And so that's how, you end it. I learned as I went on, basically. That's how you deal with teams.
Yeah. No, that's probably good, great advice for leaders out there, is that you never stop learning. You never stop thinking that
never. No.
When the flames are gone, the search for answers begins. Prometheus Forensic Services are independent specialists in fire and gas explosion investigation, delivering clear, court-ready evidence across the UK and internationally. They hold ISO 9001 accreditation for fire investigation. Prometheus also delivers specialist training courses. Find out more at www.prometheus-fs.co.uk. Prometheus Forensic Services, revealing the truth behind the fire.
Were there sort of any kind of key finds that you made in the mortuary that sort of helps identify people, or anything that you say stumbled across in the mortuary that made you all stop?
There was quite a bit that made us all stop for many varying different reasons. A lot of it was new. We found that the sort of established DVI rules didn't really work in the environment we were in. So we had to change them, which caused some panic. And the UK DVI did come down and reviewed what we were doing whilst we were doing it. And they agreed, fortunately, at the end, that yes, it was best practice what we were doing. But that was a bit of stress I didn't need. I was under enough as it was, but they were checking out what we were doing. One of the, but there's lots of different things we learned. One of the things we had to deal with is viewings, family viewings. Now, it was quite quick. When you think back to days sort of 20 years ago, it was fairly standard for families not to be denied the opportunity to view, but to be very heavily dissuaded from thinking about viewing their loved ones. And we've moved on from that, fortunately. We've learned that isn't the right way to do it. So we have moved on. But then all of a sudden, you've also got cultural concerns. For some cultures, they have no option. They have to view the remains. And quite often there's sort of procedures that have to be done by the family or by representatives of the family. So then how do you do it? It's bad enough if you've got somebody that's intact and been involved, or largely intact, and been involved in a public transport type incident. But in a situation like this, how do you actually do a family viewing? So we had to basically write a protocol for that. And it was quite, it was quite involved. Families would sometimes turn up with children. So the children were sort of separated at that point, very sort of gently, and the coroner would look after the children. She would get them to do colouring, and she would speak to them in her office. So she was part of the team there for that. The anthropologists we had, they would also run a process where they would explain to families what had happened. Not specifically to their loved one at this stage, just what had happened and what happens in a fire like that. To the point that they would also show families photographs of the inside of Grenfell Tower, the flats. Never the flat that was relevant to their particular family, but just to explain to them, this is where we recovered your mum's remains or whatever. And then the anthropologist would explain to them what happens in that, in a situation like that to the body, and explain to them what they were going to see. So it was a big, long process to prepare. You can't just sort of wheel somebody into a room and pull back the curtain like they do on all the TV shows, because that would just be brutal and horrible. And so that each process was done like that, and the family would be taken in, and the remains would be shown to them. The anthropologists would be there. One of the team would be there as well, just to answer any questions they had. And it worked well every time. It must have been dreadful for those people, but I think that we developed a process there that made it a little bit more bearable than it might otherwise have been. But there were other things we were learning along the way. I mean, DNA. Everybody wants to know about DNA. Can you match these associated remains using DNA? DNA, especially at that time, was moving so fast in terms of what you could get from degraded samples. But we didn't know. If you looked at research from a year ago, it would be out of date. So we had to basically do that all again, look at the burnt remains coming in, and start to build up a bit of an idiot's guide, for want of a better word, where based on colour and appearance. If the bone looks like this, then yes, it might be worth seeing if you can get some DNA off. If it goes beyond, it may be a sort of scale with 5 or 6 different amounts of burning, and you get to sort of beyond this point, no, it doesn't work. Yeah. And again, if you did that now, I'm sure it would be different again. But we didn't use DNA that much. Most of our anthropology was although it's not a primary, anthropology was a main one. We did do some DNA on bits and pieces. Odontology was very high up there as well, and we had to learn a bit of new science there, or the odontologists did as well, because a lot of the teeth became detached from the jaws, and teeth in temperatures like that don't remain intact. And so you can't look at the teeth, but the jaw, the voids where the teeth were, you can start to do work on that. So they very quickly were sort of making dental identifications on remains that had no teeth, which was, you had to get your head round a while, but it was, the science was there, and they became very skilled in doing that. Again, a large team of odontologists.
Yeah. God, I never even realised that. Obviously, I knew that, you can identify someone by their teeth from the history that's been recorded from their teeth. Never, no teeth there. Yeah.
Because the other thing is, if you get maybe somebody where, depending on how they've been recovered, sometimes you'd have a little bit of soft tissue, which you could get a DNA profile from. But then how do you get the profile to match it with when the person's home is destroyed?
Yeah.
We were lucky on a couple of occasions, somebody had some earbuds at work, got a profile off of those. The other thing we found is that something called a Guthrie test. Some of you will know what that is. Do you know what a Guthrie test is, Chris?
Oh, I've heard.
Put you on the spot there.
You have, haven't you? I've heard of the Guthrie test. Go on.
It's the heel prick test that's done on a baby after it's born.
That's right. Yeah.
Where they squeeze to do sort of various tests and things like that. Now, they're not allowed to keep those. That's sort of fairly new that they're not allowed to keep those. But I don't think anybody really considered in practical terms what you do with all the ones you've got already before the date when they suddenly said these have to be disposed of and so on. So we then had to start trying to work out where people were born and go back and try and retrieve these Guthrie tests from various dingy hospital storerooms, often in a situation where the hospital were a bit unsure whether they were supposed to have kept it and where they stood legally, because the person who donated the blood couldn't give consent. So that but they were quite useful when we had these Guthrie tests, because you had a reasonably reliable source there where you could start to match. They were the easy ones, because then when you get somebody where you've perhaps lost several members for the same family, you're starting to get involved in kinship relationships with cousins from other parts of the world. So, that's when you really rely on your DNA experts to try and work out how these family groups all go together, because it was beyond me.
Yeah. But I've been involved in a DVI case, so I was a body recovery team for the Shoreham air crash, where 11 people lost their lives. And we were finding on the first few days that we were going back and forth. So we'd have, a temporary mortuary at the scene, and we'd go out, we'd collect our sort of remains. So we'd collect one part of the remains, bring it back to the temporary mortuary, go out, get another bit, bring it back. And on day one, I'd walked 26 miles in one day, just going backwards and forwards. And the sort of protocols around it were you have to record each one individually, bring it back to the mortuary, and then go back out again. And we had to rewrite the rule book for that, because we were finding, like I said, we were racking up miles and miles. We were getting physically exhausted. And when it came to the point where we were recovering, like body remains the size of your hand, it was just not practical to keep on walking backwards and forwards. So we would go out and we'd kind of almost fill up a body bag with individually packaged sort of body remains, each individually numbered and each individually recorded, but it would just save us that trip every single time, because it's not until you actually work on a case. And I think you used the phrase before, a normal DVI case, but I don't know if there is such a thing, because they're all so unique, aren't they?
No, they are different. I've been involved in 3 and they were all completely different. Yeah, I mean, because at Grenfell, again, we were sieving the remains down to the point where you'd find a single tooth. So, but again, it's difficult. You go into a flat and it's just everything that's combustible is destroyed. And you'd be looking at what looked like to be the remains of a sofa, but you didn't know whether it was, in effect, Mrs. Smith's sofa or Mrs. Smith, because, literally it had all combusted, but you couldn't just assume. You had to sort of sieve every single last bit to get, to make sure you got every trace. People didn't stay in their own flats at Grenfell. People moved around fleeing the fire. So it wasn't just a question of saying, well, this is flat number 25, therefore this person lives there. Yeah, they did. But that doesn't mean the remains you found in there are that person, because somebody else may have forced their way in to get away from the fire. And when you go up to flat 110, that's where the resident from flat 25 may have been. It's very difficult to work it all out.
Yeah, definitely. I won't use the phrase "were any mistakes made." I like the words "lessons." So I think you've already alluded to, you've learned a lot at this scene. But were there any lessons that you would say take away that could help people that would sort of investigate sort of similar scenes? Heaven forbid they happen again. Well, I know that one did happen in Hong Kong not too long ago. But yeah, is there anything that you can take away?
I mean, practically not, no, because I think we learned lessons every single day. It was all new. Nobody had ever done anything quite like it before. So it was constant learning. One of the things I would say, though, especially for students, I know certainly my students don't necessarily enjoy writing contemporaneous notes and maybe don't understand how important they can be. Well, you mentioned earlier on about the inquiry. Yeah, well, I know, yeah. But no, that's true enough. But you mentioned the inquiry earlier on. And so something that you may have done at the Tower, that they were asking questions, a bank of solicitors and lawyers. It wasn't just a simple courtroom. This was an entirely different process 7 years later. So by that stage, yes, you will have some memories, but whether you remember the details or not. So that's when it's really important to note everything down. But also, and I'm the world's worst for this, but also to do it in a way that 7 years later, when you're being asked a question, that you can find it. It's about how you do your notes, structuring your notes. So almost like there's little bookmarks effectively at the side. So if you get asked about a particular item or a particular photograph that you took, that you can go straight to it. Because if you've just got blocks of text, you'll be reading and reading and reading, getting more and more stressed. You'll be holding your notes and they'll be shaking and you won't be able to find it. So just to stress how important I know we go on about it when we're teaching, and certainly, when we're supervising people at work as well, about making sure they make full notes, but it really, really is important. It won't make it painless and worry free appearing in front of an inquiry or at the Old Bailey or somewhere like that. But certainly, if your notes are there to back you up, you can sort of relax around that to some extent.
Yeah. But whenever I've written my notes, I've always thought, what would future Chris think of these notes? Would future Chris be happy to, travel back in the past on this bit of paper, looking at it and know exactly what he did? Not just what he did, what he saw, but all the decisions that I made as well.
Yeah.
And it might be that...
Certainly will current Andrew shudders when he thinks about the notes he made over the years. Occasionally I'll find something and you'll be like, oh dear.
Oh dear.
Somebody once said to me, can you show us an example of your notes as an example? It's like, no. You don't want to see my notes. No.
Particularly, back before accreditation and things like that. This is the good thing about accreditation, I feel, is that, it gets people writing more, recording more, doing things.
Bit more structure. Yeah. Bit more structure to it. So, yeah. I mean, the other thing really is imaging. It's so important to get good imaging because, once you've taken an image of something before you've disturbed it, you don't get that opportunity again. So, it's making sure that you're happy with your image. There's no problem with taking the same image 10 times if it takes 10 times to get it how you want it. Yes, you might have to explain why you've done it, but it's far better that you do that and get an image that you think that shows everything, would make sense to a jury member or someone like that, or somebody on an inquiry panel before you move on. Because once you've moved that item, then you've lost that opportunity. And so imaging. It's not just a question of just pointing a camera at something and taking a picture. It's studying that image as well to make sure that you're happy to move on every time.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people can be felt like that they're rushed into taking pictures and things like that, but you want to just take a sort of gentle walk through the scene, make sure when you're walking through that scene, you're capturing everything around you. Because particularly, if you've got a key piece of evidence or things like that, it can be sort of easy to just run straight to it almost with a camera, not really study.
Oh, yeah.
I like to draw pictures a lot of my scenes as well, because particularly
sketches are good.
In fire scenes or say BPA scenes, so blood stain pattern analysis, the kind of temptation is to just go in there, take a picture, and then move on. But does just taking a picture like that get you studying what you're seeing and it making sense in your head? Whereas if you start sketching it, you think, oh, actually, where I'm sketching this kind of fire pattern, it looks more like a kind of V-shaped convection plume.
Yeah.
So this must be...
Sometimes it's clearer in a sketch than it's difficult to capture it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, I mean, I did see, I don't know whether, because I've been gone a few years and things do move on quite quickly, but some of my students, in the essays they've done, have talked about scene examiners wearing body-worn video cameras. And I quite like that idea. I remember the difference it made when you go to a murder scene or something, and you say, can I have a look at the body-worn video? And you'd watch the body-worn video and you'd see how the initial officers interacted with the scene, because they're usually so focused on something. Maybe they're going straight into sort of really complex life-saving events. They don't have a recollection of picking something up off the table and moving it onto the kitchen worktop. No. They don't, they won't, but you get that body-worn video and you can see exactly what they have done. Not because you're trying to get them into trouble or anything like that, but just so you can see how the scene has been changed since, with the interaction of humans.
Yeah.
And you get there, and if they're there with the ambulance, we all know what the ambulance service do an amazing job, get people from the air ambulance out. But if they decide they want to do open heart surgery on your victim in the middle of your scene, it's amazing how different it looks afterwards.
100%.
So quite often it's useful to have
Yeah.
that body worn video,
Yeah.
so you can see how nice and neat and clean it was
Yeah.
beforehand.
Yeah. I remember one of my first murder scenes, I think 10 police officers went in there beforehand because the first one wasn't happy with it. So they called in another one, and then everyone around the area just came in to have a second, third, and then eventually 10th opinion.
Yep.
And I can still see, when I close my eyes, the picture that I took of all my markers with footwear marks. And I ran out of markers, and we had, it was up to 100 of these yellow markers with
Yep.
numbers on. And yeah, I'd run out of them. And it was just in a small hallway. It just creates chaos. But then, when it's the ambulance crew or fire crews, people like that have to go in and save lives. Yeah.
Yep.
We just
have to unpick it at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I was going to ask you on, Andrew, we don't normally in the police talk about political sides of things, but now we're both free at the police. I thought it's quite timely that a former member of the Reform Party who joined Reform in February, Simon Dudley, he made a comment about the Grenfell fire. He said that the deadly blaze was a tragedy, but, and this is a quote, everyone dies in the end. A group representing the bereaved of Grenfell have called Dudley's comments ignorant and callous, and I will add that Nigel Farage, so leader of the Reform Party for anyone that doesn't know him, described the comments as deeply inappropriate and said they were rather shocking to many people. As someone who has worked on that scene, obviously quite closely, and you've worked with people who have worked on that scene as well and seen what they've all gone through, how do comments like that leave you feeling?
Horrified. I mean, it doesn't matter what party anybody represents, really. Those comments like that, and we've had comments from various different politicians over the years, they're just completely cold and unthinking of what it's meant to people, of people who are still effectively waiting for justice 9 years on. Is it 9 years? Yes, it is, isn't it? 2017. Yeah. 9 years on. There were horrendous mistakes made in that building, not necessarily in the way it was initially designed. It was not perfect, but it worked, and they didn't find any shortcuts in the original design. But certainly when the building was renovated, there were so many things that went wrong, and those problems are still there. There's still hundreds, if not thousands, of blocks which have got combustible cladding on them. So to sort of dismiss, well, they all die in the end, that's a horrible thing to say. And certainly there's an ongoing frustration, because I don't know what you feel, but how many times have you heard somebody say lessons will be learned? I think they should ban that phrase, because you can almost bet when somebody says lessons will be learned that they won't be. Yeah. And Grenfell was no exception. There was a fire a few years before that in Southwark at a building called Langley House, where it was combustible cladding, and there was a stay put policy, and all the sort of similar. It was still tragic, and people did lose their lives. It wasn't quite on the scale of Grenfell, but all the lessons were there to be learned, and they did say that afterwards. The then government housing minister said the lessons will be learned, and they didn't learn anything. There was no effective difference by the time the Grenfell fire happened. In fact, after Grenfell, when they started looking at other buildings where the risks might be, they went back to Langley and looked at the repairs and discovered that the repairs had been made with combustible cladding. So even when you've had a situation where the building failed in that respect, they went back and replaced the cladding with another inferior, dangerous product. So lessons aren't learned, and they're still not there. I'm not suggesting that it's easy. In terms of, if you just said, well, you've got to ban everything combustible on the outside of a building, well, then balconies, people that live in these sort of mock Tudor homes with, what are you going to do about that? Because they've got timber on the outside, it's combustible, so it's not straightforward, but it shouldn't take as long as it has to sort out. I just can't imagine what it must be like to have bought a newly built flat around or shortly after the time of Grenfell Tower to suddenly find it's got combustible cladding on it and not to be able to move. You're stuck. You're stuck looking at enormous bills because they still haven't sorted out who's paying in many cases. So, yeah, I mean, the comments made by that gentleman this week were appalling. And quite rightly, he's not a fit person to be in that role. And he's no longer the spokesman. But it's unfortunately, it's wider than that. There needs to be a big wake-up call with many politicians, because it looks like, 72 people died at Grenfell. Surely their legacy must be change. But it looks like, I mean, how long is a reasonable time? I'm just worried that 72 people, that wasn't enough. And that if that's not enough, what is?
One person should be enough, shouldn't it? Not 72.
Yeah.
And then you think,
Yeah.
yes, if 72 people, if that's not enough, then, like you say, what is? And I wouldn't mind the phrase "lessons will be learned" if it was followed by something like, "And here's what we're going to do about it," and then see that put into action.
Yeah,
because
I accept why that sometimes can't happen, because if you're going to have an inquiry into something that will be looking at not just how a building failed, but how organisations failed. So sometimes it can take a long time. But even then, the people themselves, organisations will know what their own failings were, and they don't have to wait for a public inquiry to actually make improvements. And I think many didn't. I think the Fire Brigade certainly made a lot of changes into their, by the time the inquiry had reported.
Yeah. But I think, I saw that quote from the politician who's supposed to be representing the people of this country. And I thought, you are not putting yourself in the shoes of the victims' families, the people that work down there, the wider community. So how can you represent people of this country?
No, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's been really inspiring. And I'm sure that anyone wanting to get into forensic investigation, or just anyone that's interested in it, will be really interested in what you had to say today. So thank you so much.
No, it's been a pleasure. And I'm sure if anybody wanted to speak to me at all, then if you contact Chris, I'm sure he'll pass on my contact details should you wish.
No, please do. If you want to speak to Andrew, then get in touch. I'll link the social media handles that you can follow, and message me through that. And I'll put you in touch with Andrew. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much.
The night folds over the city like a trench coat collar turned up against the rain. And somewhere in the dark, the truth is still smoldering like the last cigarette in an ashtray. If you want to keep riding shotgun with us, subscribe to The Evidence Trail wherever you get your podcasts. And when the mic goes silent, find us at Evidence Trail on social media. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and remember, in forensics, the smallest detail can be the loudest witness. And if you're a crook walking the evidence trail, watch where you step.